know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
You're that jaywalking punk anarchist. Jaywalking punk anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer, taking a look at For a New Liberty by Murray Rothbard, originally published in 1973. The key idea of this text is classical liberalism, the non-aggression principle, private property rights, and capitalism are good, and government and monopoly on arbitration and collectivism are bad. This is basically the capitalist, libertarian, anarcho-capitalist manifesto. The ANCAP bread book, if you will. I'm kind of stuck in a bind with this review because I want to critique the purely capitalist solutions named in the text because I know that they would be abhorrent, yet I also think that our current system is bad and that an anti-capitalist anarcho-communist solution would be best. For example, replacing our current police force with private police corporations would be a disaster. However, I do despise the class and racial bias that exists in our current police state, and I wish to see it replaced with a more egalitarian, democratic, and accountable police apparatus. The bulk of the misunderstandings in this text, and in anarcho-capitalism in general, stem from not understanding collective decision-making. As social creatures, humans need to be able to come up with decisions collectively, and these decisions have expectations and conditions for the individual. But this is not, in itself, slavery, as many anarcho-capitalist libertarian folks often like to claim. But you'll see what I mean as we keep going. Just a heads up, this video is long, but the book is long, and there was a lot to correct here, so I guess what I'm trying to say is, I read it so you don't have to. So without further ado, let's take a look at the text in depth. Part 1, the Libertarian Creed. Part 1 basically explains the two main components of capitalist libertarianism, anarcho-capitalism, the non-aggression principle and private property rights. Rothbard explains the non-aggression principle thusly. No man or group of men may aggress against the person or property of anyone else. This may be called the non-aggression axiom. Aggression is defined as the initiation of, the use or threat of physical violence against the person or property of anyone else. One issue here is the term initiation, but I covered this extensively in my Capitalism Violates Snap video, so instead I'm going to move on and ask, what does it mean to commit violence or threat of violence against property? If I buy from a thrift store a jacket of yours that was mistakenly donated, have I committed violence against the jacket? What if you swear that the jacket's yours, but I'm not convinced? What then? The crux of this argument here isn't about what is or is not considered violence against a piece of property, but rather what is considered legitimate or illegitimate ownership of property. This concept was covered in the book Give Them an Argument, which I reviewed recently. Let's take a look at that. The NAP just tells you not to violate morally legitimate property claims. It does not tell you, it can't tell you, which property claims are morally legitimate. In this way, perhaps the concept of NAP violates Hume's law. It can say you ought not violate property, but it can't discern what legitimate property is. Great. Next, Rothbard addresses the second main tenet of his worldview, private property rights. Starting with self-ownership, he states, the right to self-ownership asserts the absolute right of each man by virtue of his or her being a human being to own his or her own body. That is, to control that body free of coercive interference. Sure, okay, sounds fine so far. Rothbard continues. Communism holds that every man should have the right to own his equal quotal share of everyone else. If there are 2 billion people in the world, then everyone has the right to own 1/2 billionth of every other person. The participatory communist world cannot be put into practice, for it is physically impossible for everyone to keep continual tabs on everyone else. Wait, what? Yeah, that's impractical. That's why no one's advocating for that. Having expectations and conditions for participation in a group is not having equal share of everyone else. If you want to live in my apartment, you have to pay your share of the rent. If you want to work at a grocery store, you have to follow the safety rules to avoid injury to yourself or others. And at the town or county or federal level, we have expectations for participation, a preferred level of educational attainment so that you don't become an undue burden on everyone else, and minimum qualifications for dwellings such as adequate plumbing and fire safety standards. Having collectively agreed upon rules and expectations when it comes to socially existing in a space is not every man having the right to own his equal quotal share of everyone else. Don't be ridiculous. Rothbard goes on to address ownership of products. He states, "Surely, if every man has the right to own his own body, and if he must grapple with the material objects of the world in order to survive, then the sculptor has the right to own the product he has made by his energy and effort, the veritable extension of his own personality." Okay, but what if, as Kropotkin says,
"There is not even a thought or an invention which is not common property, born of the past and the present. Every new invention is a synthesis, the result of innumerable inventions which have preceded it in the vast field of mechanics and industry."
Where do we draw the line? If I go out into the woods and chop down a tree and make a chair, my knowledge of woodworking is reliant on a vast history of knowledge that led to someone teaching me woodworking. And the saw and pencil and other tools I used rely on a vast production and distribution apparatus beyond me as an individual. Resource extraction like mining quarries to get to the graphite for the pencil and the metal for the saw blade, and timber companies providing wood for the pencil and the saw handle, and also distribution infrastructure, which brought all these items from resource extraction to production and finally to me. It's a continuation fallacy. I certainly do far more to make the chair than an intern at the corporate office that manages the quarry that mined the metal that made the saw blade, but there is no point in which the link between them and myself is severed. Rothbard moves from self-ownership and item ownership to discuss private property ownership. He states, "The natural rights justification for the ownership of ground land is the same as justification for the original ownership of all other property. For, as we have seen, no producer really creates matter. He takes nature-given matter and transforms it by his labor energy in accordance with his ideas and vision. But this is precisely what the pioneer, the homesteader, does when he brings previously unused land into his own private ownership." There are a lot of problems here. To name a few, there is a finite amount of land. Eventually, some collective understanding of how the land is to be divided up will be needed. Also, the quality of various portions of land is unequal. People are going to fight over the best land, so how will we facilitate this distribution? Also, the use of land has far-reaching implications for water cycles, air cycles, plant and animal cycles. How will we decide what is allowed on one piece of land if what happens to it has far-reaching implications? Not only this, what defines use? And what defines ownership? And furthermore, what defines unused? Rothbard goes on to argue how the government is an infringement on the values of market libertarianism. He states, "First, every other person or group receives its income by voluntary payment. Only the government obtains its income by coercion and violence. A second distinction is that apart from criminal outlaws, only the government can use its funds to commit violence against its own or any other subjects." Okay, so we have two main arguments here. First, capitalism is voluntary and the state is not. And second, capitalism is non-violent and the state is violent. First, voluntary? No. Let's say that you're on a desert island and someone with food asks you to perform sexual favors in exchange for food. Is that voluntary? Let's say that you're in an equally desperate situation which has left you to slave away at 2 or more thankless jobs for the privilege of accessing food, clothes, and shelter. Is that voluntary? I guess you could always go become a hermit and die alone in the woods.
Having the option to flee a system does not make that system voluntary, it just gives you the option of becoming a refugee. Even if I like my job, doing it is still not voluntary, because I have to have a job or I'll be destitute. And that's fine, but it presents a few problems. Like, it ruins our ability to negotiate for better conditions, more control over our workplace, or better pay. You have to work to live, but the boss doesn't need you specifically for anything.
Second, many aspects of a capitalist economy are violent, from withholding necessary foods and medicines to intentionally cutting corners that cause unsafe consumer products and working conditions to hiring company goons to break up union organizing efforts. Not only this, the government doesn't have a monopoly on violence, it has a monopoly on arbitration, which it can use to legitimate violence. That is, the government has the final say on the law of the land, and it can use that law to permit violence. Furthermore, this law of the land is reflective of who is in power in the government. For example, a capitalist state might turn a blind eye to the violence of company goons beating striking workers, or to the KKK lynching black citizens, while a communist state might turn a blind eye to violence against counter-revolutionaries, or to the seizure of mansions. But Rothbard disagrees with my prognosis that the government is a reflection of the society it exists in. He states, "We are not the government. The government is not us. The government does not, in any accurate sense, represent the majority of the people. But even if it did, even if 90% of the people decide to murder or enslave the other 10%, this would still be murder and slavery." I reject this framing. Providing that the government in question is a functional democracy, then the government would be a reflection of the governed. We engage in collective decision-making all the time, and it's not distilled down into murder and enslavement. I may not like paying my share of the rent, but I came together with my roommates, and paying my share is one of the conditions of living here. I may not like paying taxes, and there sure are things that my taxes go to that I disagree with, but I want, for example, a public school system. I want every citizen to have a basic education despite their ability to pay for it. Capitalist, libertarian, and cap folks do this all the time, crying about collective decision-making and hyperbolically calling all of it murder and slavery. Rothbard ends part 1 stating, "The Libertarian Creed can now be summed up as 1. The absolute right of every man to the ownership of his own body. 2. The equally absolute right to own and therefore to control the material resources he has found and transformed. And 3. Therefore the absolute right to exchange or give away the ownership of such titles to whoever is willing to exchange or receive them." Part 2. Libertarian Applications to Current Problems. Part 2 is half explaining why everything bad that ever happened was because of the government, and half explaining how full libertarian anarcho-capitalist free market capitalism will solve everything. I mean, obviously, this is what the whole book is about. First, Rothbard argues against taxation, of course, and calls it theft and slavery and torture and murder, and, well, now who's being hyperbolic? I thought I was using dramatic irony. Don't get lost in semantics. The fact is, taxation is theft. The government is taking something that belongs to you under threat of violence. It's just like when someone robs you walking down the street. It is theft. Well, what about your use of public schools and the interstate highway and other various publicly provided goods and services? Isn't that theft if you use these without paying for them? Okay, maybe I use these services, but the payment is forced, and therefore theft. I'd happily pay for these services from the free market. Well, that's just a wildly implausible way of providing things that we would want for society. Many publicly provided goods are a direct response to market failures, for example, providing schools and streets for low-income areas that could not pay market value for them. I support having education provided for all citizens regardless of their ability to pay, because I want some basic educational attainment to be required for participation in my country. Is that really an incidence of theft? Well, it's an infringement on my freedom to force me to cover the cost. It's an infringement on my property rights. But this is a very regressive view of rights. Look, I've already explained how property ownership is a disaster in my video Capitalism Violates NAP, but basically we should want substantive freedoms. I don't want to live in a community where people are left destitute and forced to turn to crime out of desperation. I have much more freedom when I help collectively provide some universal assistance to all people. The only Theft is that we are being robbed of the opportunity of living in a community where desperate people are left with no other option but to steal to survive. So it is theft, and now you're just justifying it. It is a collective theft to avoid a potential theft committed by the indigent. Maybe I'm coming at this all wrong. Do you think that Jeff Bezos committed theft? No. How so? Well, he didn't invent or create any of the things that made him rich. The internet, fiber optics, and satellite, and all the things that go into modern high-speed publicly available internet. That was brought to us with massive public spending. He didn't invent those things. By your logic, he stole them. No. Listen, at the base level, who owns the money? What do you mean? I mean, who owns the money? Who prints it and gives it its value? Who determines that money is the official exchange currency of the country? Perhaps as a verified product of exchange, taxation is needed to maintain the functioning of capitalism through protecting private property rights, maintaining an official currency, and other things key to the functioning of capitalism. Yeah, maybe, but that's why I'm switching to Bitcoin. Okay, cool. Well, let me know how that goes when massive chunks of the population aren't receiving any education and don't have any social safety net to fall back on, and they start getting hungry and desperate, and there's no military or police left to defend the unjust capitalist distribution of property. Gulp. Rothbard then addresses freedom of speech and argues that demonstrators should have to ask the property owner if they could rent the street for their protest. But this is a terrible criteria and points to exactly why we need public areas in a civil society. The owner of a privately owned street will always be motivated to maintain commercial use. Take Black Lives Matter, for example. This movement should be a slam dunk for libertarian support. It is about the state police killing unarmed citizens with impunity. But is Black Lives Matter commercially friendly? Well, a recuperated version maybe, but that's not what I mean. I mean the radical critique of institutionalized racism. Is that commercially friendly? No, not really. What about funds? How many Black Lives Matter protests would have taken place if each one of them had to be approved by a capitalist street owner and had to pay to rent the space? Probably none. In regards to pornography, sex work, abortion, gambling, drug use, and various other individual freedoms, I basically agree with Rothbard's stance, although I come to my conclusions from a vastly different framework. Rothbard then addresses public education. Basically, public education is forced and bad, and Rothbard concludes, most children would be far better off if they were allowed to work at an early age, learning a trade, and begin to do that which they are most suited for. There is a discussion to be had here about self-determination and being a minor. In anarchism, to what extent does a child have self-autonomy? At the same time, as social creatures, I want to live with a population that is educated. It only hurts me to live in a population in which a huge percentage of people don't understand their basic civic duties, let alone how to read or write or do arithmetic. A lot of Rothbard's critiques could be addressed with a massive overhaul of education as an institution, and not a conversion to a purely capitalist model. A major problem with Rothbard's understanding of education is that he views it in purely economic terms, rather than social terms. He sees education as a job training program only, and not as an avenue for self-improvement, building an understanding of civic involvement, or creating an educated citizenry. Rothbard goes on to discuss where poverty comes from. He argues that poverty, high infant mortality, deaths from alcohol or drug addiction, and the like are all caused by cultural factors, not economic factors. You know, all those long-standing cultural traditions of having a dilapidated educational system and inadequate housing and an aggressive police force and food deserts and a total lack of meaningful employment opportunities and all those deep-seated cultural cornerstones. Now wait a minute, these problems are caused by the government. The lack of meaningful employment opportunities and lack of childcare are due to too much regulations and taxes being too high. What do you mean? Well, I wanted to start a new garment factory, but there were all these minimum wage laws that cut into my projected profits. Not only this, I would have to compete with welfare to get employees. The public just isn't desperate enough. Well, that doesn't sound all that bad to me. It's hard to make demands on your employer in this economy, especially with the cost of living and the cost of childcare. But that's just the thing. I was going to hire children. It was going to be a daycare and internship opportunity for low-income youth to receive work experience. See, I just wanted to provide more childcare and employment opportunities, but my business model was killed by excessive regulations. Well, Straw Dog, I think you may appreciate Rothbard's 4 ways that the government can get out of the way of the American people. First, it can abolish, or at least drastically reduce, the level of all taxation. Obviously, he believes in that. Second, and as a corollary to the drastic reduction or abolition of taxation, would come an equivalent reduction in government expenditures. You know, wasteful expenditures like all the ways that government literally allows capitalism to function, such as protecting property rights, unemployment insurance, tariff protections, and research and development grants. Third, if the government also cut out the numerous ways in which it taxes the poorer to subsidize the wealthier, such as we had named above, higher education, farm subsidies, irrigation, Lockheed, etc. This in itself would stop the government's deliberate exactions upon the poor. True! This one is actually true. And finally, one of the most significant ways in which the government could aid the poor is by removing its own direct roadblocks from their productive energies. Thus, minimum wage laws disemploy the poorest and least productive members of the population. That's what I'm talking about. Get rid of these minimum wage laws and child labor laws. Get all of these disabled folks and uneducated folks and children and get them desperately working for starvation wages at I mean working at my wonderful child care and garment internship opportunity. Hey, Rad. Do you know anyone who'd be interested in investing in a child care garment creation internship investment opportunity? No. Rothbard then addresses the famous "who will build the roads" question.
You not fooling a libertarian by bringing up them bitch-ass roads!
And Rothbard argues that there could be 2 types of private roads. In one type, all the landowners in a certain block might become the joint owners of that block. Let us say the 85th Street Block Company. This company would then provide police protection, the cost being paid either by the homeowners directly or out of tenants' rents if the street includes rental apartments. Rothbard argues that landlords would want to attract tenants by supplying safe streets, and so they would pay handsomely to maintain the streets. Because who ever heard of slumlords providing subpar conditions for desperate populations? Rothbard continues, another type of private street ownership in residential areas might be private street companies, which would own only the streets, not the houses or buildings on them. And again, of course, only those who could afford it would have nice or sufficient streets, while the poor would be left getting squeezed by slumlords. What kind of roads would the Rust Belt get? Or the ghetto? We have food deserts where grocery stores won't even be built to provide quality food for people. What kind of roads would the market provide for them? Well, none. Not if there's no money in it. If you want a closer look at the problem with privatizing massive interconnected infrastructure like roads or railways or plumbing systems or electrical grids, I highly recommend Sean's video, How Privatization Fails Railways. Let's have a brief look at that.
Let's say a country with a nationalised rail service funded by taxes needs to make some change to the system. This can be in terms of maintenance, replacing and upgrading tracks, closing or moving stations, implementing new regulations, whatever. Now, since the system is controlled by the government, they can relatively simply just go ahead and make the changes. In a privatized system, however, making changes is much more complex. Because of the fragmented nature of the privatized network, implementing a change means the government interfacing with potentially dozens of different private companies, all responsible for different parts of the system, and all motivated not by making the process go smoothly or quickly, but by profit. This unnecessary level of complexity makes what should be relatively simple changes cost far more and run for far longer than they need to.
Next, Rothbard discusses protection of the streets. He states, "We are already familiar with police protection provided by private merchants and organizations. Within their property, stores provide guards and watchmen, banks provide guards, factories employ watchmen, shopping centers retain guards, etc. The libertarian society would simply extend this healthy and functioning system to the streets as well."
The solution is easy. Privatize the police department.
Okay, sorry, I'll try and address this more seriously. So, yeah, stores want to protect their property, and they hire additional protection beyond that which is provided by your standard police, and they can do this because they have the money to do so. But we have police because we want the public to have protection despite their ability to pay for it. Private police would be biased to those who pay their paychecks, unlike publicly provided police who are at least hypothetically impartial. Rothbard goes on to argue that these private police would bring an end to police brutality. But with private police, there is no interest in impartiality. Protect those who pay your paychecks and not those who don't. Look at what the private system has offered us so far. Private prisons, which are known to be much more brutal than public prisons, something I've covered on this channel before, and private military contractors who have the same problem. Now don't get me wrong, the police have a problem with violence, and they often favor the property-owning class over the general public. Look at how they respond to protests, for example. The police do desperately need massive reforming. But my problem with the police doesn't come from some irrational fear of collective decision-making, like the capitalist, libertarian, ANCAP types do, but rather from the frustration with the lack of democracy, the lack of impartiality in a capitalist society. The solution here is obvious: to make the police more collectivist, more democratic. Police voted for by the districts they patrol, for example. Maybe check out Non-Compete's video titled "How Do Anarchist Police and Military Work?" if you'd like to know more about that. Basically, like with education, the solution is more democracy, not more capitalism. Next, Rothbard takes things even further. He states, "Suspicious residential neighborhoods would insist that any people or cars entering the area have a prior appointment with a resident. It might be charged that all this will allow freedom to discriminate in housing or use of the streets. There's no question about that. Fundamental to the Libertarian Creed is every man's right to choose who shall enter or use his own property, provided, of course, that the other person is willing. Discrimination, in the sense of choosing favorably or unfavorably in accordance with whatever criteria a person may employ, is an integral part of freedom of choice, and hence of a free society. But of course, in the free market, any such discrimination is costly, and will have to be paid for by the property owner concerned." And Rothbard goes on to give some ridiculous example of a landlord refusing to house redheads. This is actually a pretty common critique of the libertarian anti-democratic model, that it allows for discrimination and even the creation of ethnostates. The argument basically goes like this: "We should have a totally libertarian society without any democratic institutions or laws. Just let the market decide everything." But won't that lead to discrimination? This is why we need minority protections like civil rights and anti-discrimination laws. But discrimination wouldn't even happen. It wouldn't be economically viable to be racist. You would lose money. But that's historically inaccurate. Look at the history of redlining and whites-only signs and Irish need not apply signs and all that. Not to mention the systemic biases in hiring and housing that still exists today. Studies have shown that a black person is less likely than a white person with the same credentials to be hired or receive a bank loan. Yeah, sure, a restaurant might miss out on the money from black customers, but if the white owner and their white, more affluent clientele want segregation, then discrimination will occur. Bringing it back to private police, Rothbard then addresses the idea that not everyone will have coverage.
Poor people get murdered more often than any other group of people. So why do the rich people have to pay higher taxes when it's the poor people getting murdered?
Whatever happened to taking some initiative and accepting some personal responsibility? Whatever happened to investigating your own goddamn murder like Ronald Reagan did?
And he states, "But what of the unlikely case that a neighborhood does not have street police, and a policeman of Company A happens to see someone being attacked. Will he rush to the victim's defense? That, of course, will be up to Company A, but it is scarcely conceivable that private police companies would not cultivate goodwill by making a policy to give free aid to victims in emergency situations, and perhaps ask the rescued victim for a voluntary donation afterwards. You know, giving away your services for free like capitalists so often do. Like, sure, if you're a security guard at the front door of a hotel and someone across the street is being attacked, maybe you would rush to their aid. In fact, this human trait is a big argument in Kropotkin's book, Mutual Aid. But this isn't an instinct that we can rely on as a literal substitution for publicly provided protection. Secondly, this argument that the Company A, Police Protection Insurance Company, will help the uninsured people for good PR is ludicrous. Just look at all the people who are left to die from lack of access to needed medications or treatments because their medical insurance cut them off. My good sir, I can't help but notice that your previous insurance company called your shoulder surgery an elective surgery, and considered your broken rib a pre-existing condition. Right. Well, I won't waste any more of your time. I just wanted to let you know that I work for TBS Insurance. That is, the Total BS Insurance Company. And I would like to cover all of your surgeries and your physical therapy free of charge. All that we ask is that you consider switching to our insurance company, or at the very least, provide us, if you can, with a small donation for our troubles. And always remember, in your time of need, you were helped by the Total BS Insurance Company. Thinking about allocation, Rothbard responds to critics thusly. But how could a poor person afford private protection? This problem, of course, applies to any commodity or service in the libertarian society, not just the police. But isn't protection necessary? Perhaps, but then so is food of many different kinds, clothing, shelter, etc. Surely these are at least as vital, if not more so, than police protection. And yet almost nobody says that therefore the government must nationalize food, clothing, and shelter, etc., and supply these free as a compulsory monopoly. Psst, Rothbard. I say that. Probably not in the way that you're envisioning it, but I look at all the market failures around me regarding food, clothing, and shelter, and I've determined, as most leftists do, that all essentials need to be decommodified. Following the description of private police, Rothbard discusses private courts. He states, how would courts be financed in a free society? There are many possibilities. Possibly each individual will subscribe to a court service, paying a monthly premium, then calling upon the court if he is in need. Private courts basically have the same problem that private police do: who can afford it, and also bias. Rothbard argues that if two courts have a dispute, assuming one party isn't wealthier and so they can simply afford better and more biased police and court protection, then the courts will defer to a higher court. And so here we basically have a state. If multiple private police departments disagree, they will defer to courts. If multiple courts disagree, they will appeal to a higher court. And wouldn't you know it, eventually you have some sort of primary court and subsequently a government. And Rothbard kind of agrees. He basically destroys this whole government is a monopoly on arbitration and therefore slavery argument. No joke, he basically walks the whole thing back. He states, it should be clear that a legal code is necessary to lay down precise guidelines for the private courts. If, for example, Court A decides that all redheads are inherently evil and must be punished, it is clear that such decisions are the reverse of libertarian, that such a law would constitute an invasion of the rights of redheads. Hence, any such decision would be illegal in terms of libertarian principle, and could not be upheld by the rest of society. First, earlier, discrimination was called an integral part of freedom of choice and hence of a free society, and Rothbard used discriminating against redheads specifically as an example. So what is it, Rothbard? Is discrimination illegal in terms of libertarian principle, or an integral part of freedom of choice and a free society? But also, Whoa! This concept of a legal code, a legal agreement that covers an entire population, that kind of sounds like a constitution. And how are these codes decided? Who decides them? Because, Rothbard, buddy, that's a government. And lastly, Rothbard argues that if your police or court company is acting unethically, which would happen as I explained earlier using abuse in private prisons as an example, if they're acting unethically, you can just hire a different police or court company to challenge them. This all sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare, worse than any state. You might not think it because I'm such a smarty pants book pupperoo, but to be honest, I have a hard time coordinating a Netflix account, a PlayStation Plus account, a health insurance policy, a car insurance policy, student loans, car payments, internet bills, cell phone plans, etc., etc., etc. And what Rothbard is proposing is that in addition to all this, we all have stickers on our cars to prove that we paid the fees to use the private roads. But there would be multiple different road companies. So just like you're subscribed to a few different streaming services, you got to be subscribed to all the different private road companies in your area, assuming that you have the money for all this. But you also need a private security insurance company for your neighborhood. And Rothbard assumes that you'll have the money to hire a private police force as well, and that the police won't cut corners or turn into some kind of protection racket or form a monopoly, despite capitalism's tendency towards monopoly. And he suggests that if the police are corrupt, you could just hire additional police to investigate them, assuming that you would have the money not only for one private police insurance company's fees, but additional money for an additional police insurance company to fight the corrupt police force. And if needed, the two competing police forces can settle their differences in a private court, unless the private court is being unethical or biased, in which case you can hire an additional court to challenge them. And they can defer to a higher court above them, and a higher court above them, and so on, ultimately deferring to some sort of Supreme Court, which would basically be a government, using a code of law, which would basically act as the law of the land, the government's constitution. Basically, it's just like the meme. State bad, state TM good. Rothbard then discusses national defense and argues that only a state can compel a population to support an attack on another nation. I recommend books like The Shock Doctrine, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, or Imperialism, The Highest Stage of Capitalism, to see how capitalism actually encourages neo-imperialism. But none of that matters because Rothbard literally argues that wars wouldn't even happen because there's no profit in them. Rothbard moves on to discuss conservation and the environment. However, there is a lot that Rothbard misunderstands here. For example, he literally states, "Why is it that a copper miner, once they have found and opened a vein of ore, do not mine all the copper immediately? Why instead do they conserve the copper mine, add to it, and extract the copper gradually from year to year?" Well, there are reasons for this. Perhaps there was a cost-benefit analysis. The company looked at the cost of extraction versus the value of the land versus the cost of labor versus the value of the remaining copper versus the projected future price of copper, and the decision had nothing to do with conservation in the environmentalist sense. But also, what's with the inclusion of the term add to it? They conserve the copper mine, add to it. Extracting a non-renewable resource more slowly is not adding to it. This comment alone makes me very skeptical of Rothbard's arguments here. Rothbard then tries to make a tragedy of the commons argument. He states, "The open range was the failure of the federal government to apply the policy of homesteading to the changed conditions of the drier climate west of the Mississippi. The result of this tragically short-sighted refusal to allow private property in grazing land itself was an overgrazing of the land, the ruining of the grasslands by grazing too early in the season, and the failure of anyone to restore or replant the grass." This actually sounds pretty intuitive, but let's watch an instructional video to learn more.
None of the herdsmen own the field, and they can see that the field may not be around forever. They see no point in conservation and just try to use it before someone else does. Okay, so we can go on to apply this model to unregulated open access fisheries, open access forests, and unregulated college dorm sink. But the problem with applying this model to the real world is that we have to assume, among other things, that people don't communicate or work together, which isn't true. With a field like this, people will generally get together and make plans about its use. They may act as a single unit, or just just partition it into sections, and they'll regulate the number of people that can use it. And if people are working together and communicating, then it's not really open access. It's not like every management situation is open access until somebody does something about it. So you don't tend to see the open access problem because people don't work together. You tend to see it in situations where people can't work together.
Okay, so the tragedy of the commons argument is kind of a crock of shit. Public ownership does not actually work in that way, and if needed, you could always institute different rules and practices to improve communication and collective decision-making. Rothbard then extrapolates this BS tragedy of the commons argument onto the oceans. Yes, privatize the oceans. Rothbard states, a simple but effective technique that could be used for increasing fish productivity. Parts of the ocean could be fenced off electronically, and through this readily available electronic fencing, fish could be segregated by size. By preventing big fish from eating smaller fish, the production of fish could be increased enormously. And if private property in parts of the ocean were permitted, a vast flowering of aquaculture would create and multiply ocean resources in numerous ways we cannot now even foresee. Okay. For anyone who has two brain cells to rub together, this probably sounds like an ecological disaster, let alone potentially impossible. But let's actually look at something similar that exists in our world today. Industrial agriculture. If you take a field and you plow it and till it and replace all the life on the field with acres and acres and acres of wheat, have you increased productivity? Well, yes. Is there more life forms on the land than before? Probably, sure. But what is the outcome? A massive decline in biodiversity? Monoculture causing nutrient depletion and so toxic fertilizers have to be used? Monoculture leading to a boom in the population of the pests who eat that crop? This leading to increased use of pesticides which lead to further toxification of the land and other health risks, as Roundup certainly demonstrates.
You can drink a whole quart of it and it won't hurt you.
You want to drink some? We have some here.
I'd be happy to, actually, but not really, but...
Not really?
I know it wouldn't hurt me.
If you say so, I have some glyphosate.
No, I'm not stupid.
Not only this, but we have erosion of topsoil, dead zones as waterways are flooded with runoff, blah, 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 blah. You get the idea. I imagine the same would take place in the oceans. Give companies a square of the ocean and they will find out what fish or mineral is most profitable and reorganize the ecology of that square to maximize production of that one resource. And a boom in production would occur, but also an ecological catastrophe. But Rothbard disagrees. He states, only private property rights will ensure an end to pollution. Rothbard argues that a company would not want to destroy or damage their own property, and that they would not want to risk being sued for damaging someone else's property. But this ignores two troubling facts about capitalism. One, sometimes doing a cost-benefit analysis, polluting ends up being the more profitable option. If you own a factory and it's far away from your personal water source, the cost of polluting water might not mean that much to you, not if the alternative is halting production. And two, in regards to polluting other people's property, perhaps you've heard of the term environmental racism? Environmental racism refers to the way that some of the most damaging practices are put in communities that don't have the political or economic clout to fight back. Look at the Dakota Access Pipeline. Look at people fighting for clean water in Flint, Michigan, or the people affected by oil spills after Hurricane Katrina. Sometimes a company will just pollute someone else's land, knowing they won't be able to fight back. There is one part here, however, where I actually agree with Rothbard, and I feel like it kind of blows his worldview right open. That is, air pollution. Rothbard argues that all such emanations which injure person or property constitute aggression against the private property of the victims. Basically, all those factories with smokestacks are violating NAP because they are invading the personal property that is our lungs. Now, arguments like this about the way that we are collectively impacted by what takes place on private property demonstrates why private property needs to be abolished and replaced with a more democratic model. Again, see my video, Capitalism Violates NAP. Rothbard goes on to argue, the argument that such an injunctive prohibition against pollution would add to the costs of industrial production is as reprehensible as the pre-Civil War argument that the abolition of slavery would add to the costs of growing cotton. For all the ridiculous stuff that Rothbard has said, this is super true. I just wish that he would extend this argument out to how personal property is infringed on, and even hurt by, basically all aspects of the capitalist private property system. Rothbard concludes this discussion on pollution by arguing that only capitalist innovation can solve the problem. And look, we now have electric cars, the problem's getting solved already. But there's actually some problems here. One, capitalism does not innovate. R&D is super expensive, and so capitalists don't do it. R&D is usually done through research and development grants, military scientists, and publicly funded university research. 2, capitalism only solves the problems that are profitable to solve. It won't solve problems that there is no profit in, like fixing Flint's water supply, for example. 3, greenwashing. Firms often lie or misrepresent their numbers to seem more environmentally safe than they really are. And 4, capitalism wants individual solutions, which will always be more profitable but more ecologically destructive. It will always be more profitable for each of us to own our own energy-efficient car, with its own battery and engine and tires and oil and insurance and maintenance costs, rather than having us all share a robust, sustainable public transit system. Rothbard's final chapter of Part 2 is about war and foreign policy. He argues, no state has any legitimate property. All of its territory is the result of some kind of aggression and violent conquest. And I'd say the same about private property under capitalism. And Rothbard basically argues that we should not obligate others to fight on our behalf. And interestingly, he says that guerrilla warfare is perhaps the most justified form of warfare because it is a group collectively fighting for their own interests. He pins a lot of the blame for war on the state and ignores capitalism's role in promoting war. Again, I'd recommend Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, or The Shock Doctrine for a better understanding of how global war is born out of globalized corporate capitalism. But what do you expect? Rothbard literally argues that wars are not profitable, so there you go. Part 3, Epilogue. This is the What Should We Do section of the text. Looking at propagation of capitalist, libertarian, anarcho-capitalism, Rothbard argues, libertarians must, therefore, engage in hard thinking and scholarship, put forth theoretical and systematic books, articles, and journals, and engage in conferences and seminars. I wonder when they're going to finally engage in the hard thinking aspect of this quote. But I jest. Then Rothbard critiques collectivism, stating, the utopian goal of the left, communism, the abolition of specialization and the adoption of uniformity, could not work even if everyone were willing to adopt it immediately. It could not work because it violates the very nature of man and the world, especially the uniqueness and individuality of every person, of his ability and interests, and because it would mean a drastic decline in the production of wealth, so much so as to doom the great bulk of the human race to rapid starvation and extinction. Citation needed. I have no idea where he got this from, but that is ridiculous. Rothbard then brings up what kinds of groups he sees as most susceptible to libertarian arguments. Campus youth, youth in general, the media, middle America, and small businessmen. And Rothbard states, the potential appeal of libertarianism is a multi-class appeal. It is an appeal that cuts across race, occupation, economic class, and the generations. Which is why free market libertarians are all economically secure white guys in their teens and early 20s, right? And Rothbard concludes, we wish to break with all aspects of the liberal state, with its welfare and its warfare, its monopoly privileges and its egalitarianism, its repression of victimless crimes, whether personal or economic. Only we offer technology without technocracy, growth without pollution, liberty without chaos, law without tyranny. and defense of property rights in one's person and in one's material possessions. Conclusion. Well, that's the Libertarian Anarcho-Capitalist Manifesto for you. I feel like I've sufficiently debunked all of this. If you're interested to know more, I recommend some of my various other videos regarding capitalism, such as Capitalism Violates NAP, my Pericon review, my Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism review, my review of The Conquest of Bread, and my recent review of 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism. I really didn't even need to dunk on this book so bad. Rothbard's arguments for an overarching legal code and for protection from air pollution basically blow his entire worldview apart. Arguing that courts will need some kind of overarching legal code to pull from demonstrates that a collection of individuals existing together in a society, forming a town or province or country or whatever, do need some sort of agreed on legal code. And how do we determine that code? A government. And if people are having their rights violated by air pollution, what about people whose waterways are damaged by pollution? What about people whose air quality is damaged by deforestation or beef production? It's almost like the way that private property functions in capitalism violates NAP. But we knew that already. If you'd like to know how some folks think a capitalist, libertarian, anarcho-capitalist society might work, or if you'd like to know a little bit more about why neoliberal late-stage capitalism is a total crock of shit that gives you massive brainworms, then I recommend For a New Liberty by Murray Rothbard. And as always, I'd like to thank my wonderful patrons. Thank you, Elsa Turner Gibb, April Shadows, Bobby Lean, Camazot's Altar, Cider Shot, Dirt Kelly, Donnie Tiny Hands, Emmanuel Vasconcelos Torres, Fuzzy the Fair, Ishwanda, Jack, Jake Vivak, Jan Waterman, Jiggly Puffer, Jilly Bean, Callie, Linux Powered Communism, LS, Luce, Lucy, Lukulele, Mad Blender, Marvelous, Mara Penguin, My Fake Name, Nick, Noochman, Oded Sayer, Oleta Notabui, Only Dog Knows, Petey Morin, Paint Eater, Pat Ron, Sean Butterfield, Susie O, The Fool, The Surfs, Tokupime, Tom T, Tony Harrison, Tyler Cook, Vera, and William Johnson. And if you'd like to support me on Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/radicalreviewer. And if you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.